No. Hi, my name's Arthur C. It's a pleasure to introduce this evening's reading and conversation, one more in the long and beloved series sponsored by Lannan Foundation. I want to begin by thanking all the staff and board members of Lannan who have, over so many years, supported literature and enriched the cultural life of Santa Fe and of this country through their wide, varied programming. In 1997, Lannan Foundation moved from Los Angeles to Santa Fe, and Patrick Lannan was interested in moving the Readings and Conversations series here. But he wasn't sure if the Santa Fe community would come out and support it. He invited me to curate the inaugural reading series at Site Santa Fe. I invited Derek Walcott to read on May 8, 1997. Staff set up 200 chairs in the main space, and there was still a large overflow audience at that first event. The Santa Fe Readings and Conversations series was an immediate success. This evening, I want to take a minute to honor the memory of Patrick Lannan. Patrick told me that when he grew up in Chicago, his father hated to drive, so he drove his father to meetings around the city. And while Patrick was driving, his father recited poetry, and the sounds and rhythms of poems were formative and unforgettable. Patrick loved poetry. He affirmed the power of a single book to not only enrich the life of a reader, but to deepen and transform that person's understanding of life and of their place in this world. This evening, we are here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Copper Canyon Press. Copper Canyon is an independent, nonprofit, small press devoted to publishing poetry exclusively. It was founded in Denver in 1972 by Sam Hamill, Tree Swenson, Bill O'Daly, and Jim Goutney. In 1974, the press moved to Port Townsend, Washington, where it has stayed ever since. The earliest books by the press were letterpress books, where each word of each poem was set by hand. When I was a young poet looking at publishers, I was drawn to Copper Canyon Press by the quality of poetry they published and by the beautiful design of their books. Although it took me many years to join the press, when I did so in 1994, I understood that I had found a publisher that believed in my work, not just in the poems of a single book. That kind of commitment is rare in the publishing world. In 1994, I remember having lunch with Sam Hamill, who raved about a new managing editor, Michael Wiegers. Over sushi, Sam told me that at a recent staff meeting, he said he needed someone who could take care of X, and Michael said he could do it. He then said he needed someone who could take care of Y and of Z. Again, Michael said he could take care of them. While Sam gloated that he had found an astonishing managing editor, I understood that Michael Wiegers had a capacious energy and deep connection to the press, that he would become the future executive editor and lead it forward. Over the 29 years I have been connected to Copper Canyon Press, I have seen Michael Wiegers develop the press in all ways. Today, the list of poets that the press publishes is remarkable and more inclusive than ever. It is impossible to name everyone, but I will single out 5. The press has published such major American poets as W.S. Merwin and C.D. Wright. It has extended its reach internationally and published poetry in bilingual format by Nobel laureates Pablo Neruda and Thomas Transtromer. It has also reached back to ancient China by publishing Red Pine's translations of the collected poems of Hanshan, Cold Mountain. Over 29 years, Michael Wiegers has led Copper Canyon Press with singular vision and determination. He has also taken risks and published first books by emerging poets while also maintaining an ongoing commitment to poets well established. And this visionary work is a collective effort. I thank the entire staff of Copper Canyon Press, those who have come before and those who work here now to make the press what it is today. In addition to Michael, on behalf of Copper Canyon authors, I thank Joseph Bednarik, George Notek, Claretta Halsey, Rio Yamaguchi, Marisa Vito, Ashley Winter, Janine Armstrong, Julie Johnson, Heidi Sewall, Casey Tavares, and the entire Copper Canyon Press board. I know this dedicated staff works tirelessly with financial recompense that does not begin to match time and commitment. In its utter dedication to poetry, Copper Canyon Press is a cultural treasure. It stands in resistance to profit-driven corporate publishing, where, as Ezra Pound once lamented, nothing is made to live and endure, but to sell and sell quickly. This evening, Michael will introduce the two exceptional poets who are about to read, and I will join them on stage after the readings for a conversation. Just as I introduced the first Lannan and reading conversation in Santa Fe many years ago, it is now a privilege to introduce this reading tonight at the Lenzik Theater. Please welcome Executive Editor Michael Wiegers.
Hello. Thank you, Arthur. That's typically very kind and generous of you. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight here in the Lenzik as well as virtually online. I also want to thank Copper Canyon's poets from the past 50 years, including those who are going to be on stage tonight, Arthur, Jericho, and Paisley. And my best wishes go out to Jory Graham, who had hoped to join us this evening but was unable to travel. Our poets have made everything possible at Copper Canyon over the past 50 years, and their work is the promise of the next 50 years. Before I introduce tonight's poets, I want to say a few quick words, I hope not quick, about Copper Canyon Press and our 50th anniversary. In my office at the press, there's a wall of shelves across from my desk that holds all the books the press has published over the past 50 years. Those shelves were built by somebody else and filled by the work of many unseen hands. With each new book I've had the privilege to sign on to be published and added to those shelves, I consider that wall and all the history that it represents. As an independent nonprofit press, I see our role in an activist light. And in the literary history on those shelves, I'm looking for future guidance. In the past, we imagined the future of Copper Canyon. We imagined the future of poetry. When we publish poetry books at Copper Canyon, we're not simply pushing a commodity out into the world to be consumed. We're aiming to engage imaginations, enrich minds, invite beauty, and activate outrage to ultimately transform lives. A poem, through its invocation to breath and heartbeat, to metaphor and imagination, is an art that celebrates the individual within a shared language of community. At its best, poetry plays a role that is distinctive from the utilitarian prose I'm speaking now by virtue of its music and its delight in the play of language. A poet published by Copper Canyon Press, June Jordan, said it much better than I can. Quote, "And so poetry is not a shopping list, a casual disquisition on the colors of the sky, a soporific daydream, or bumper sticker sloganeering. Poetry is a political action undertaken for the sake of information, the faith, the exorcism, and the lyrical invention that telling the truth makes possible. Poetry means taking control of the language of your life. Good poems can interdict a suicide, rescue a love affair, and build a revolution in which speaking and listening to somebody becomes the first and last purpose of every social encounter. In the books of Copper Canyon Press, in the voices and choices of all those poets we've published, the language of life, the speaking and listening that June Jordan talks about, comes alive on shelves, in pages, between covers, across generations, beyond aesthetics and politics, through each assertion of individual identity that is in search of a social fabric. When I consider all our books, I look to those poets who have laid the groundwork for the next generation, those poets who are providing guidance for all of us in our lives. Without Arthur Z., we might not know about Ocean Vuong or Sherwin Bitsui. Without Ted Kooser, we might not have seen the poetry of Natalie Diaz. Without Pablo Neruda, we wouldn't have heard the voice of Javier Zamora. Without Jory Graham, we wouldn't have heard of Amanda Gunn. Without W.S. Merwin, we might not have realized the work of C.D. Wright. And without C.D. Wright, we wouldn't have encountered the poems of Ben Lerner. And without Ben Lerner, we wouldn't have encountered Ocean Vuong, who was one of Ben's students. The list of poets who led other poets to the community of Copper Canyon Press is extensive and growing. Jericho and Paisley and Arthur continue that work of poetry's future, already in writing workshops and in manuscripts. I'm seeing younger poets and students writing duplexes, a form invented by Jericho Brown. And Jericho's work goes beyond the intimate space of the workshop. He has shown that sometimes the music and meaning of poetry is so powerful that it replaces the direct utilitarian arguments of prose, as it has on several occasions when his poems enlivened the opinion page of the New York Times. And then there's Paisley's work, which transforms the otherwise prosaic arguments of history into beautiful lyricism and metaphor. There's little doubt in my mind that upcoming generations will be deeply influenced by Paisley's lyrical multimedia engagement with history, race, text, and image. Her hybrid works are expanding how we think about poetry and the poet's historic role as a public intellectual. Her poems teach me so much at the same time that they make me feel and engage. Meanwhile, Arthur, who many of you know, is an incredibly selfless poet about whom I say the same thing. He teaches me through his poems and invites me to see the world anew, both through his many years as a teacher here in Santa Fe, as well as through his translations. He has consistently foregrounded the work of others and gives back to the reader all that he has gathered as a poet. These poets, like those who have come before them, have helped build Copper Canyon Press. Similarly, there are many people in the background who have quietly made our work possible for over 50 years. My many colleagues and our board members over those years, and also people like Tree Swenson, who helped found the press 50 years ago and traveled 1,000 miles to be with us here tonight. I particularly want to acknowledge Patrick Lannon, to whom I dedicated our anthology because of his steadfast and unwavering support of Copper Canyon, and because of his belief in poetry as a force for social and political change, and a vehicle for personal liberation and empowerment. I also want to personally thank all the staff and board members at Lannon who over many years, through their support of independent publishers like Copper Canyon, have made a place for poetry in our national public discourse. There's nothing like Lannon Foundation in this country, and their influence will be sorely missed. Thank you. Our first reader tonight, Paisley Rekdal. I've had the great pleasure of working with Paisley over the course of 3 books, including Imaginary Vessels, Nightingale, and her most recent collection, West, a translation. I adore her work for its engagement with myth and history, its investigation of trauma, race, sexual assault, and gender, using the tools of classical literature alongside historical texts and popular entertainment, as well as artifacts and documentary photographs. Her poems move just as easily between freight trains and scientific examination as they do between Greek myth and the voice of Mae West. In addition to her 3 books of poetry with Copper Canyon, she is the author of 4 other books of poetry I wish we'd published. A collection of essays entitled The Night My Mother Met Bruce Lee, as well as Appropriate, a provocation, which addresses race and cultural appropriation in this country. The former Poet Laureate of the state of Utah, she now directs the American West Center. Her newest book, West, a Translation, translates a poem written by a prisoner at Angel Island at the same time that it investigates the role of race in the building of the American West and its railways. It's an extraordinary book, as you'll hear tonight. She is, in a word, a marvel. Please join me in welcoming Paisley Rekdal.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Lannan Foundation, for inviting me. Thank you, Copper Canyon, for publishing me. This has been a dream press. This is a dream reading. I'm actually a little nervous because I can't see any of you, so I have no idea how many of you are there. And this is going to be a reading where your interaction is actually crucial. So I was asked to write a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad. And because I was the Utah State Poet Laureate at the time, and the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental's completion was coming up. I'm half Chinese, and so I was more than happy to write them a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad. What I wanted to do, though, was think about entering the history of the Transcontinental through Chinese exclusion. 13 years after the Transcontinental was completed, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed into law, and it lasted until 1943. It's an act that affected pretty much every Chinese American family on the West Coast, including my own. So I take a poem that was carved into the walls of Angel Island during the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it elegizes a detainee, another Chinese detainee, who committed suicide during that time period. It's part of a dialogic pair. What I'm going to do tonight is actually play the poem, and then we're going to go to the poem. Each character in the Chinese poem opens up into a story about the cultural impact of the Transcontinental Railroad, but you're going to tell me what you want to hear. Each poem comes with a lyric note. All the lyric notes together make one essay, and depending on time, I'll be able to read some of those notes. Okay, so here we go. Hopefully this is working. Technology is terrifying. So,
Hastui Adot at Benanida.
聽到火車嘅聲音，
Δεν είμαστε επιβάτες στο τρένο εμείς. Το
指摘
τρένο
が聞
είναι
こえてくる
επιβάτες που
そ
καβαλάει
れ
εμάς.
は私たちの
This is the sound
重
of a
荷とな
train.
り
No
今までの計り知れない人々の汗、
聽到火車嘅
涙、
聲音，
苦難を乗
Na
せて
base
This is the sound of a train.
No viajamos en el tren. Αυτός είναι ο ήχος ενός
We do
τρένου.
not ride on the railroad. The railroad rides on us.
Mikenanish Ebikego Deinika Hajo Nahasli.
噩耗傳聞實可哀，吊君何日果思回？無能冥目憑誰訴？有失應知悔此來。千古含愁千古恨，思鄉空對望鄉台。未酬壯志迷壤土，知以雄心死不悔。
all right, so I'm going to go to the poem now. Every single one of these characters opens up into a different story. And now you're going to tell me what you want to hear. Do you want to know about adoption, African-American workers, porters, archaeological artifacts, biracial 19th century journalists, the Civil War, Chinese death rituals, descendants of the railroad workers, Chinese exclusion, phrase books from the 19th century, cholera, environmental change, gender roles on trains, hobos, Hollywood, immigration questionnaires, Irish-American workers, labor unions, land art, Robert Smithson, Manifest Destiny, mass murder, Mormons, Native Americans, the Plains Indian War, photography, polygamy, prostitution, presidential impeachment, that's one of my favorites, race relations on the train, the telegraph, or LGBTQ lives. Shout them out. Okay, wait, no, all right, wait. Wow, okay, one at a time. All right, everyone's one. Some hobos. Oh, you bastards. Okay. All right, I was afraid of that one. All right. Yeah, here we go. Dead is what they call a torn-up track whose living rails I jump to bed down in the wells and feel the thud hit every trestle steam at dawn like horses at the track I trained before the fillies foundered sick. They fired the agents' vets, they fired a rider's meet. I love how in a well you thrum with sound until your bare lips start to bleed like canisters of oil I stole inside the train. You'll find a nation what it wants to eat and wear and what it likes to buy, a ring, a phone, some jeans, a Porsche. There is no reason why to jump a train except to lose the edges of yourself. The time like pacing Moxie at the track, that speed that almost tears your hands off at the wrist. She was the last to go, her tendon bowed and worthless than insurance. No one rides a racehorse just for pleasure. No one hops a train if they can take a plane, a car whose engine speed is gauged by horses kept alive in memory for sentiment, I guess. There's ghosts of what we were and are we cannot bear to leave out in the desert where I'm going home, just not right now, I said of Moxie, not right now before the race. She hasn't many left in her. You know she trusts you, right? The trainer said, then slip me $2,000 on the shots. You were supposed to choose that after I had warmed up. I'm really just here to play you videos. But you ruined that, didn't you? Here is the note for that, if I can find it. Dead. Dead. If the transcontinental was meant finally to draw America closer to China, it failed. The transcontinental facilitated trade between the coasts and helped shape a national cultural life, but it did not increase American trade to China. Likewise, if the transcontinental was meant to lower travel costs for passengers, that too failed. The cost of a sleeper car from Chicago to Sacramento now runs you close to $6,000. Trains traveling to Sacramento are largely empty of passengers, loaded instead with cars, appliances, crates of olive oil, military vehicles, nuclear waste. The train, imagined as an international event, turned us insular. Perhaps the most significant and accidental benefit was for hobos migrating during the Great Depression. Riders, as they call themselves now, are rare because of the cheapness of Greyhound and the ubiquity of the car. Riders jump container cars whose trains stop off for loading. They hide in a container's front and rear in spaces that can fit two at a time to sleep, though the open-air exposure means riders have to wear bandanas to keep their chapped lips from bleeding. Riders track safe jumping times with the aid of a Xerox crew change guide that, according to the writers, can never be shared. When I asked one rider why he did it, he said he didn't know. Most people who jump trains now are young, white, middle class. They take aliases on the rails and tend to avoid each other. Another rider I spoke to said they're attracted to the anonymity and the lawlessness. To ride the rails, he told me, you need to like being invisible. After a few hours in the open air listening to the cars rock beneath you, you start hearing shrieks and voices. The sound moves through your body the way it was the world to scream you can't turn off. It's as close as he's ever come to an extended hallucination. Maybe that's why the riders you meet are mostly ex-military. The exposure, the noise, the motion, it sends you out of body, out of time. One guy returned from Afghanistan and told me it was the only thing that could console him. He said it was the closest thing to being in a war. Okay, so what else would you like to hear? People were yelling a lot. Cholera! You are now my favorite person. No one ever chooses cholera. Super happy about that one. Let me see. That is so dark, right? That's so dark. I'll play with the subtitles so you can all see the work I did, the work I did. Barry. First, it was a pocket watch the archaeologists unearthed. its plated chains strangled inside this grave's mast roots, black hands clawing at 12 and 2. Trains run on time as well as coal, the company owners knew, so that the iron cars could pass each other untouched in the dark. Proximity requires partition. One must invent zones, rules, schedules. One must assign value to what threatens the capital, what counts as a loss. Someone fevers in his rented room. Someone coughs and claps a hand to another's back, and a ghost of hours passes like a shadow straight through you. Only a matter of time. Once the cholera came before they'd point to us, the company men, who left our bodies where they were felled, spike handlers, carpenters, Irishmen, all bludgeoned and dumped at Duffy's Cut. Beside these tracks, they hired us to build. Barry. Oh, thank you. Yeah. In Massacre at Duffy's Cut, Tragedy and Conspiracy on the Pennsylvania Railroad, brothers and authors Drs. William E. Watson and J. Francis Watson argue that the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad lied about the 1832 cholera-related deaths of 57 Irish railroad workers just outside Philly. They claim it wasn't cholera that killed them, but mass murder sparked by panic over cholera. While not a story about the transcontinental, a cholera story is still about the train. Both the Irish and the railroad were blamed for the spread of cholera, the Irish incorrectly, the railroads correctly, as ease of travel made disease transmission more rapid among growing populations. Cholera readjusted our ideas of space and community, just as the railroad changed our ideas of time. Because of the train, phrases such as time's up, time's a-wasting, and the train is leaving the station entered our vocabulary. The transcontinental led to the division of the nation into 4 standard time zones to prevent crashes. But if the railway changed our clocks, it also changed our body's perception of time. Railway spine was a 19th century term for the bodily and psychic disorders that passengers experienced after suffering railway accidents, the result of being hurled through space, propelled into the future. Death suddenly was everywhere. Like cholera, the train made us uncomfortably aware of our mortal intimacy with each other, which may be why John Palfrey of the Brattle Square Church in Boston delivered this sermon on cholera, declaring society plagued by corruption, but that it was through this disease that a merciful God would straighten the world out. Such moralizing continues. In 2020, certain environmentalists lauded the COVID-19 pandemic for its influence on climate change, though the World Health Organization estimates that between January 1st, 2020 and December 31st, 2021, 7 million people had died. Intimacy does not require or necessarily produce empathy. In 1889, a local historian named Julian Saxey interviewed a man who swore he'd seen the ghosts of the 57 Irish workers dancing over their mass grave. Saxey suggests the man's memory was faulty. He'd imagined ghosts from the atmospheric lights of Ignis Fatuus, caused by so many of the cholera victims being buried together without a sufficient covering of earth. The man refused to believe it. "I saw what I saw," he insisted. Saxey's transcript is full of the man's tics and drunken repetitions. It is designed to make us distrust its history. Or maybe that's not the point. My father, too, during the pandemic, repeated himself, afraid of death, afraid of my death. I would call every day to see if he was healthy. Our cities were in the vice grip of the pandemic, and now time had expanded to the size of a continent. For 2 years, all I could hold of him was a voice. "Don't come home," he'd beg me. Relational time asks if the thing speeding towards us is our past or our future. Perhaps because of this, the train itself became a symbol for the movement between consciousness and memory. The railroad workers were murdered in 1832. In August 2004, some were disinterred. So many died. So many have died. I saw what I saw. Oh! Where are we here? Come back to life. Okay, I'm going to play a sexy poem because I played this for the governor of Utah, and he loved it. What day? On this 7th day of the 7th month, magpies bridge in a cluster of black and white. The Sky King crosses to meet his queen, time tracked by the close-knit wheeling of stars. I watch. You come to me tonight, drunk on wine and cards, nails ridged black with opium to ease the pain of work. We are all men here. Anybody can be a bridge, little raven. Your eyes squeezed shut, but not from pain. We are a trestle, a grade we build together. What matter if you say you'd never choose me, were there women willing in this desert? I chose. I choose the memory we share of rivers, your hair of smoke and raw, wet leather. A man in another man's hand makes himself tool or weapon, says the overseer, as if a man's use to another is only one of work. Pleasure is the only chosen future. You are the home I briefly make, the country I can return to. Here, where the moon wheels its white shoulder in the dark, and you push me to the earth, slip my whiskered tip of hair into your mouth. What day? Everybody likes a sexy poem. Everybody likes a sexy poem. What day? Canadian filmmaker Richard Fung opens Dirty Laundry, a history of heroes, with the scene of a train steward reading a magazine article entitled Canada's Railway, a Symbol Under Threat. A few shots later, this same steward is locked in an embrace with a journalist named Roger Kwong, who's traveling across the Canadian Rockies to research his family's history with the train. The two men's encounter is interspersed with historical footage of the train hurtling through tunnels, the train moving both backward and forward at once, the men's sex overlaid on the technology Kwong's family helped build. Is the train, in its disruption of time, where we lose or find ourselves? My father recalls traveling back to Seattle from his East Coast college on the Transcontinental, during which time he shared a car with a young child and her mother. One night, he woke to find the child crying, the mother gone. When he went in search of her, he found the woman in a darkened corridor, skirt hiked up, legs wrapped around another passenger. It changed my picture of women forever, my father said, disgusted. I laughed. Move your hands into the dugout dirt. You can feel the nestle of bodies, the soft silt of skin and hair. Translation of a man into labor. Translation of a man into need. And what is that translation? Humiliation or rage or desire. We never stopped building the railroad. What day? Whoop, no. Not that sexy. Okay. All right. I have time for one more poem, and if there's no choices, I will... Which death... Everyone likes a death ritual, too. Okay. Chinese death rituals. I have to read the note before, and this will come with two poems. And all you have to know is this thing, body. As part of their death rituals, Chinese workers would pay a huiguan, a district association, to bury their bodies, then have a bone collector exhume them months later to scrape away the flesh and break the bones up to fit into earthen jars or wood boxes. These boxes would then be shipped to Hong Kong to the Tunghua Hospital, which would distribute the remains to the workers' families. The man may die on foreign shores, but he always returns home. Bones were shipped from San Francisco to Hong Kong as early as 1855. No one knows how many Chinese workers died building the railroad, as the Central Pacific kept no casualty records, so no one knows how many coffin boxes linked to the railroad were shipped to China. And not all men's bones were collected once returned. I am sent a video by a mixed-race artist named Summer Mei-Ling Lee, who has documented the hundreds of boxes abandoned in Tunghua's mortuary. In her video, Lee paints an art gallery with scenes of Guangzhou in ash ink made from burnt incense. I am startled by the detail of her scenes. Lee depicts houses, roads, villages. Many images include seabirds, which reminds me of something Pawpaw, my grandmother, once said about the cormorant, the bird whose neck fishermen fitted with a tight ring so the bird could catch fish but never swallow them, as it could never swallow the souls of the dead it hunted on the seas. Why would birds hunt souls? I asked Pawpaw. Because, she said, some people never find themselves anywhere in life or death. In her video, Lee stands before her installation in the tiny San Francisco gallery. She looks white, the gallerist says to the audience in Chinese, but she is one of us. The artist flinches as if slapped. The camera catches the flinch. I am at home, watching the flinch on my screen. Body. A carload passed last night, their bones returned in barrels marked pickles. Thick as bees, ants, locusts, celestials lay siege to nature in her strongest citadel. Their genius is imitation. Show them once to do a thing, and their education is complete. Wherever you put them, you'll find them good. They can withstand freezing, hunger, thirst, and heat, their simple, narrow, but not dull minds running in old grooves. Congealed quantities, crystals of social substance. Unicated as boys or sodomites, they breed defunct in the heat of germs. They can be shipped to shore in great quantities. Even their clothes come, identical, studded with rivets. And I'll just play this video and one funny one to end, no notes. Return. If falling leaves return to roots, what grows when leaves cannot be gathered? What returns if not the body? What remains if not the soul? Who is to say these graves empty of their bones mean only loss, not that these men escape death's hold entirely? They are not home, but they are not here either, or have become so full of here, we need another word than gone. So throw out the cormorant, its leg tied with silken ropes. Let it drag the air for memory. Over and over, as many times as you want. You can't snare what isn't missing. This country claimed their bodies. It never trapped their souls. And because I'm such a bummer, I want to leave with one fun poem. And this is one of my favorite ones, and there will be no note for this one. I think it's self-explanatory. Heroic. Helen Holmes, The Hazards of Helen. Victim? Tie me up to Tressler Bridge, I bristle, buck, saw through blunt bindings, swing and shimmy to ease myself down burnished poles. Bold, cold, heroic. Lock me inside your clerk's closet, I'll pick its double lock, duck the huckster's ill-timed shot, tackle robbers in the boxcar. Intrepid, I ride astride slender waist rails, uncouple cars, and mount runaways. I turn all tails to heads, begin each film fired, despised, till I solve all crises I alone saw coming. I get my men. My fans are manifests now of different destinies. The West is a dead end for those with frailty inbuilt to their machinery. Men here hit the skids, lost it all on stocks, cows, cards, slots, topped out and constrained by history. But I'm still speculative, exciting, my amplitude the endless futurity to which my sex has always been traveling. That's why strangers eat me up in the dark, laugh when I grab the robber's mitt, the one snatching at your heartstrings, my leather valise. Now I bring my mouth down to his wrist to take a bite that only looks like a kiss. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming.
I've had the great fortune to work with Jericho Brown on The Tradition, for which he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. The moment I read that manuscript for his book, I knew that it was something really special. Over the course of the following months, he humored me as I lightly scribbled in the margins of his remarkable, beautiful book. Besides the Pulitzer, that book was also a finalist for the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Previously, I'd had the good fortune of picking his second book from a group of over 2,000 manuscripts. I had already been a fan of his first book, Please, so was over the moon when he graced us with the audaciously titled book, The New Testament. Jericho is a graduate of Howard University. He's also the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study at Harvard, as well as the National Endowment for the Arts. He's the director of the Creative Writing Program and a professor at Emory University, and he may have the best laugh of anybody I know. I don't think I've ever left Jericho's laughter-filled company without feeling unadulterated joy and camaraderie. He's a beautifully passionate poet and a good friend. Please welcome Jericho Brown.
Hi. Hello. Big thank you to Michael Wiegers for that really nice introduction. I have to say this. I actually graduated from Dillard University in New Orleans, Louisiana, and not Howard University. And I have to correct that only because the people at Dillard will see a video like this and beat me down if I don't say where I went to school. I'm so grateful to Michael Wiegers, and I'm really, really glad to be a part of Copper Canyon Press because it is the greatest poetry press in the world. Give them, a round of applause. Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Happy 50th birthday to Copper Canyon. Also, I want to say thank you to the Lannan Foundation for all the work that they've done for this event, but just for years and years, all the work that they have done to keep money in the pockets of poets. Thank you, Lannan. Michael mentioned awards, so I should say I'm really grateful also to be here with Arthur C., who is the only person in the world I can say I'm glad beat me out for the National Book Award. I think Arthur C. is the most humble, most modest national treasure that I've ever encountered. And it's always a pleasure to be anywhere near Paisley Rekdal, whose work is so completely necessary to my work. I think of her as a huge influence of mine. I love her poems. I've told her that before. I'm sure it gets on her nerves. I'm like a fan. I'm going to read you some poems. Is that okay? Can I read you some poems? Where I'm from, we always begin with prayer. So I'll start with a poem that is a prayer. Prayer of the backhanded. Not the palm, not the pear tree switch, not the broomstick, nor the closest extension cord, not his braided belt, but God. Bless the back of my daddy's hand, which, holding nothing tightly against me and not wrapped in leather, eliminated the air between itself and my cheek. Make full this dimpled cheek, unworthy of its unfisted print, and forgive my forgetting the love of a hand hungry for reflex, a hand that took no thought of its target, like hail from a blind sky, involuntary, fast, but brutal in its bruising. Father, I bear the bridge of what might have been a broken nose. I lift to you what was a busted lip. Bless the boy who believes his best beatings lack intention, the mark of the beast. Bring back to life the son who glories in the sin of immediacy, calling it love. God, save the man whose arm, like an angel's invisible wing, may fly backward in fury, whether or not his son stands near. Help me hold in place my blazing jaw as I think to say, excuse me. This next poem is about a television show that none of you have ever heard of. It was from, you're too young. It's from the late 70s to the mid 80s. It's a television show called The Jeffersons. And the poem references an episode that really did happen. I'm not making it up. And you can see all of the Jeffersons episodes on Prime Video. Sitcom. A rabbit tried to kill Louise once when I was a kid. I'm saying Louise now, but I'd have said Miss Louise then as she appeared on our screens once a week, wearing blues I haven't seen since. Her long hair curled, combed out, and pushed up into a volume so thick you felt both the power of an afro and the requirement of a relaxer on a woman rounder than most of her penthouse neighbors. Hair that wouldn't move no matter how much she shook when she yelled at her husband or when trapped by a man dressed as a rabbit who wielded a snub-nosed .38 special we thought scary before we knew what an AR-15 could do. Miss Louise never sang, but she had a voice that left you wondering how singing might sound on her. She was that beautiful and dark. They had a grown son. She wasn't a young woman. By the time I saw the Halloween rerun, the youngest men in my hometown had organized themselves into colors, red and blue. They were patriots, like patriots. They'd shoot, and they'd shoot each other too. They'd shoot you if you accidentally scuffed their shoes at a club or a concert. They'd shoot driving by from their cars into houses and parks. They'd sell you something so good, you'd sell our TV to get more of it. And I cannot say I didn't love them. They killed my first girlfriend, a stray bullet meant for her brother, and I loved them. They killed my cousin, but some of them were my other cousins, and I still loved us in all my fear of our gold teeth and oversized dickies. They'd kill me today, yet remain a problem I mean to solve. I'm grown now. I know Louise was the star of the show, the leading lady. No writer would kill her off on a sitcom. Murder is meant for real life. Anybody can get a gun, but nobody kills Louise Jefferson. There is a place where black people don't die, a deluxe apartment in the sky. All week I worried about the next episode. Mornings I dressed myself and my little sister, making sure we wore nothing that looked like the flag. And when the appointed night fell, the jokes were still funny. The rabbit apprehended. The white rabbit didn't murder the black lady. No, not on TV. Four in the morning. My mother grew morning glories that spilled onto the walkway toward her porch, because she was a woman with land who showed as much by giving it color. She told me I could have whatever I worked for. That means she was an American. But she'd say it was because she believed in God. I am ashamed of America and confounded by God. I thank God for my citizenship in spite of the timer set on my life to write these words. I love my mother. I love black women who plant flowers as sheepish as their sons. By the time the blooms unfurl themselves for a few hours of light, the women who tend them are already at work, Blue, I'll never know who started the lie that we are lazy, but I'd love to wake that bastard up at 4 in the morning, toss him in a truck, and drive him under God past every bus stop in America to see all those black folk waiting to go work for whatever they want. A house, a boy to keep the lawn cut, some color in the yard. My God, we leave things green. Labor. I spent what light Saturday sent sweating and learned to cuss, cutting grass for women kind enough to say they couldn't tell the damn difference between their mowed lawns and their vacuumed carpets just before handing over a $5 bill rolled tighter than a joint and asking me in to change a few light bulbs. I called those women old because they wouldn't move out of a chair without my help or walk without a hand at the base of their backs. I called them old, and they must have been. They're all dead now, dead and in the earth I once tended. The loneliest people have the earth to love, and not one friend their own age, only mothers to baby them, and big sisters to boss them around, women you want to please and pray for the chance to say please to. I don't do that kind of work anymore. My job is to look at the childhood I hated and say, I once had something to do with my hands. This next poem makes use of that epic poem, The Odyssey. I also think it owes a debt to this very long, beautiful sequence of sonnets that I love by Gwendolyn Brooks called Gay Chaps at the Bar. Hero. She never knew one of us from another. So my brothers and I grew up fighting over our mother's mind. Like sun-colored suitors in a Greek myth, we were willing to do evil. We kept chocolate around our mouths. The last of her mother's lot, she cried at funerals, cried when she whipped me. She whipped me daily. I am most interested in people who declare gratitude for their childhood beatings. None of them took what my mother gave, waking us for school with sharp slaps to our bare thighs. That side of the family is darker. I should be grateful, so I will be. No one on earth knows how many abortions happened before a woman risked her freedom by giving that risk a name, by taking it to breast. I don't know why I am alive now, that I still cannot impress the woman who whipped me into being. I turned my mother into a grandmother. She thanks me by kissing my sons. Gratitude is black. Black as a hero returning from war to a country that banked on his death. Thank God, it can't get much darker than that. For this next poem, you may want to know that Janis Joplin recorded the Gershwin Standard Summertime with Big Brother and the Holding Company for their 1968 chart-topping album, Cheap Thrills. Columbia released that record. She died of a heroin overdose in 1970. She was 27 years old. Track 5, Summertime, as performed by Janis Joplin. God's got his eye on me, but I ain't a sparrow. I'm more like a lawnmower. No, a chainsaw. Anything that might mangle each manicured lawn in Port Arthur, a place I wouldn't return to if the mayor offered me every ounce of oil my daddy cans at the refinery. My voice, ain't sweet. Nothing nice about it. It won't fly, even with Jesus watching. I don't believe in Jesus. The Baxter boys climbed a tree just to throw persimmons at me. The good and perfect gifts from above hit like lightning, leave bruises. So I lied. I believe, but I don't think God likes me. The girls in the locker room slapped dirty pads across my face. They called me bitch, but I never bit back. I ain't a dog. Chainsaw, I say. My voice hacks at you. I bet I tear my throat. I try so hard to sound jagged. I get high and say one thing so many times, like Willie Baker, who worked across the street. I saw some kids whip him with a belt while he repeated, please. School out, summertime, and the living lashed. Mama said I should be thankful that the town's worse to coloreds than they are to me, that I'd grow out of my acne. God must love Willie Baker, all that leather, and still a please that sounds like music. See, I wouldn't know a sparrow from a mockingbird. The band plays, I just belt out, please. This tune ain't half the blues. I should be thankful. I get high and moan like a lawnmower so nobody notices. I'm such an ugly girl. I'm such an ugly girl. I try to sing like a man boys call boy. I turn my face to God. I pray. I wish I could pour oil on everything green in Port Arthur. I wrote this next poem after finding out about and being confounded by the very long list of people who have committed suicide while in police custody under very strange circumstances. Some of those people include Jesus Huerta in North Carolina, who after having been patted down while handcuffed on the walk from the police cruiser to the building where he was to be booked, somehow managed to supposedly shoot himself in the back corner of his head. Victor White III in Louisiana, where I'm from, who, after having been patted down, sitting in the back seat of a police cruiser while handcuffed, somehow managed to shoot himself in the upper back. Sandra Bland in Texas, who after a day of fighting for her life, hung herself with a trash bag in a cell where there is live footage. That live video footage goes out just before she hangs herself with the trash bag. According to the coroner, that footage must have gone out at just the moment that she hung herself with the trash bag. Bullet points. I will not shoot myself in the head, and I will not shoot myself in the back, and I will not hang myself with a trash bag. And if I do, I promise you, I will not do it in a police car while handcuffed or in the jail cell of a town I only know the name of because I have to drive through it to get home. Yes, I may be at risk, but I promise you, I trust the maggots who live beneath the floorboards of my house to do what they must to any carcass, more than I trust an officer of the law of the land to shut my eyes like a man of God might, or to cover me with a sheet so clean my mother could have used it to tuck me in. When I kill me, I will do it the same way most Americans do. I promise you, cigarette smoke, or a piece of meat on which I choke, or so broke I freeze in one of these winters we keep calling worst. I promise if you hear of me dead anywhere near a cop, then that cop killed me. He took me from us and left my body, which is, no matter what we've been taught, greater than the settlement a city can pay a mother to stop crying, and more beautiful than the new bullet fished from the folds of my brain. This next poem makes use of the Greek myth of Ganymede, because poets can't get enough of Greek myth. And if you don't know that myth, I think it'll become clear to you as I am reading the poem. Ganymede. A man trades his son for horses. That's the version I prefer. I like the safety of it. No one at fault. Everyone rewarded. God gets the boy. The boy becomes immortal. His father rides until grief sounds as good as the gallop of an animal born to carry those who patrol our inherited kingdom. When we look at myth this way, nobody bothers saying rape. I mean, don't you want God to want you? Don't you dream of someone with wings taking you up? And when the master comes for our children, he smells like the men who own stables in heaven, that far terrain between promise and apology. No one has to convince us. The people of my country believe we can't be hurt if we can be bought. I'm reading to you retrospectively, which is to say, I'm reading a bit from my first book, Please, a little from my second book, The New Testament. My mother's still angry with me about that title. And from my most recent book, The Tradition, as well as some new poems. I had to read a new poem because my editor's here. The Tradition, one of the features of my most recent book, The Tradition, is a form I invented called the duplex. The duplex is at once a hustle, a sonnet, and a blues poem. And I'll read one for you now so that you can see how all those forms are working in this single form. Duplex. I begin with love, hoping to end there. I don't want to leave a messy corpse. I don't want to leave a messy corpse full of medicines that turn in the sun. Some of my medicines turn in the sun. Some of us don't need hell to be good. Those who need most need hell to be good. What are the symptoms of your sickness? Here is one symptom of my sickness. Men who love me are men who miss me. Men who leave me are men who miss me in the dream where I am an island. In the dream where I am an island, I grow green with hope. I'd like to end there. I'd like to finish with some love poems. Can I read you some love poems? It's maybe two. This first one is about cuddling. I love poetry. I love poetry more than anything else in the whole wide world. I hope that is clear to y'all, but I do not love poetry more than I love to cuddle. Stand. Peace on this planet, or guns glowing hot. We lay there together as if we were getting something done. It felt like planting a garden or planning a meal for a people who still need feeding. All that touching or barely touching, not saying much, not adding anything. The cushion of it, the skin, and occasional sigh. All seemed like work worth mastering. I'm sure somebody died while we made love. Somebody killed somebody black. I thought then of holding you as a political act. I may as well have held myself. We didn't stand for one thought, didn't do a damn thing. And though you left me, I'm glad we didn't. I'll finish with one more poem. This last poem is the last poem in my most recent book. It's the last poem in the tradition. It's also the last duplex in the tradition. I should tell you the story of how this is the perfect audience. I'm going to tell you the story about how this poem got written. I mentioned to you earlier that the duplex is at once a hustle, a sonnet, and a blues poem. This particular duplex adds a layer of form, as it is also a cento. As you know, a cento is a poem that is completely made up of lines from other poems, usually by other poets. This cento is a little different because it's made up completely of the lines from the other duplexes in the book, because I'm a nerd. The other reason this poem exists is when I sent the manuscript for this book to Michael Wiegers. Michael Wiegers called me on the phone and told me, I think you need another duplex. I had 40 duplexes around my house. I mean, I was sick of duplexes. Y'all know what I'm saying? And I was like, Michael, please don't make me write another duplex. And do you know that that man repeated that to me? I think you need another duplex. So I was so angry that Michael was making me write another duplex that I refused to use any new lines for the new duplex. So we got a poem out of it, and here you go. Duplex, cento. My last love drove a burgundy car, color of a rash, a symptom of sickness. We were the symptoms, the road, our sickness. None of our fights ended where they began. None of the beaten end where they begin. Any man in love can cause a messy corpse. But I didn't want to leave a messy corpse obliterated in some lilied field. Stench obliterating lilies of the field, the murderer, young and unreasonable. He was so young, so unreasonable, steadfast and awful, tall as my father. Steadfast and awful, my tall father was my first love. He drove a burgundy car. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your poems. So in one of my favorite poems that we've published by the Spanish Nobel Prize winner Vicente Alexandre, it's a poem called Who I Write For, and he lists all the living and the dead, the ordinary, the extraordinary, the terrible people he writes for. And he writes for those who don't even read his poetry. It's a really exquisite poem, and makes me wonder, who do each of you write for? Or who do you imagine on the other side of your work reading it? Do you have an idealized reader, or you tossing pebbles into a pond and hoping they make a ripple or skip across to the other side?
I have an answer to this question.
Thank God.
Good. I think, I know when I wrote my first book, I was writing a book for me when I was 19. Mm-hmm. I loved poetry so much when I was a kid growing up. And I think part of what makes me a poet is no matter, to read, like, what are you writing? You read Hopkins and then you want to write a poem? Like, why are you, really? Do you know what I mean? So I think for me, it's always been about some version of myself. And that version of myself is the self that goes to poetry for answers. And yet I get plenty of answers from poetry, and yet I always feel I'm missing something. And so when I'm writing, I'm trying to write the book that I wish existed. I'm trying to write the book that I don't see in the library or the bookstore. And I want to read that book. And since it doesn't exist, I have no choice but to write it. So it's sort of, I guess, cliche to say that I am my audience, and yet I am my audience. But I am my audience by way of a history of ancestry of poetry that goes back in the English language way long before my literal ancestors were made to speak English.
I think that's a great answer because, for me, I feel that I am writing mostly to understand my own mind. Like, I don't feel like I understand the world or my experiences in it until I can put it into poetry. And so in that sense, I feel like I am writing for myself or writing at myself, writing into myself. But working on West was a really unusual project for me because it was a commission. I was asked to do this. And when I was approaching this material, I suddenly realized there was nothing but absence. Like, the people I was writing to and about, they had not been archived. There were no documents were preserved. And it seemed like such an incredible loss. And I found myself thinking that I had a real duty. This is the first time I've ever felt that in my life as a writer. I've been blessed with the kind of freedom of indifference by the world. Like, no one cares what I write. But in this case, I felt that people did care. There was a political assignment that was given to me, because when you're a poet laureate, it's always political work. And this was a political topic. And so when I wrote this, I kept thinking about all of the people who did not have these histories preserved. And so this was a book, the most public-facing book I've ever written, and it is specifically for people. And I remember the best thing that ever happened to me was giving this reading at the governor's mansion, and a couple of descendants of the Chinese railroad workers were there. And they came up and they were crying. And I've never had that experience. Usually someone comes up with a complaint or a footnote. You got that wrong. But in this case, they were just like, it's a cliche to say it, but they felt seen. And it's true, because the archive does not see many of us. The archive has no interest in preserving us. And for me, now I'm asking that kind of question, which is, what is it that poetry does as an archive? What is it that poetry struggles to present and keep us all alive in each other's cultural memories? What would you say?
Yeah, these are great answers.
He thought he was going to get back.
Yeah, I know. You're up there, buddy. You're on it.
I don't have an ideal reader. I think when I'm writing, I'm trying to write from my deepest place inside myself and to discover things that I don't know that were there. And I like what you quoted about Alexandria writing poems for people who don't even care that poems are being written, because on the deep level, I think poems have a kind of urgency. And yes, you want the poem to be read by people you know, by strangers. You want it to be a discovery, an experience, a journey. But there's also a sense of urgency, that the poem needs to be written, that it might be a long time before a reader finds it and connects with it, but the poem still needs to be written. And that sense of urgency coming out of language and emotion and imagination is, I think, what propels me.
So before we came out here, you were saying that you had read some new poems, and that it always makes you nervous to read new poems. And so, relative to the last question in archiving poems or archiving knowledge, I'm curious, do you feel why do books matter? Does to you? I mean, and towards this idealized, or not idealized self, you said that you're writing toward a version of yourself. Does the book reinforce that version of yourself?
Yeah, I think whenever I write a book, I find that when I'm writing poems, I'm not thinking about subject matter. Subject matter emerges over time. I notice, I have 40 pages of poetry about shoestrings. And so I am clearly really interested in shoestrings these last 4 years of my life. And so my book should be called The Tennis Shoe. Do you understand what I mean? And that's really how I work. And I find that when I finish a book, I am reconciled to the subject although I wasn't trying to be, I am a bit more, I'll say, reconciled to the subject about which I was writing, that I see it newly. I think it has to do with what Paisley was saying about how poetry organizes thought. When I make a book, I've finally figured out
what it is that would not stop my obsession about blank or about whatever. Do you understand what I mean? And so, and when I say I'm writing two versions of myself, I mean that different parts of me need different poems, and there are different parts of me that need to be reconciled to different subjects. You know?
Yeah, the discovery about what you're writing about is funny because when I was working on Nightingale, for example, I started that as a lark. I mean, I was rewriting Ovid's Metamorphoses, just for fun, because I had time. And I just thought, well, and I loved it because I was like dealing with character. These were really highly narrative poems, and so I was able to deal with psychology and dialogue and plot, and I was so excited. It just seemed like being an actor or something for a moment. And I thought I was having a really great time until I was talking to someone, and someone said to me, well, that's a really rapey book. And I said, no, it's not. And then I'm like, yes, it is. And then I realized what I'd been dancing around, which was, I'd experienced a sexual assault, and I had written a poem actually called Philomela, which didn't satisfy me. It had been published, it had gotten Best American Poetry. It had all the trappings of this should be done, you should be finished. But I really didn't like that poem. And so I went back and I said, what was I missing? And then I spilled out this long hybrid work called Nightingale a Gloss, and that's when I realized, oh, that's what the book is about. There's this moment of like, oh, I thought we were doing this fun thing, and like, no, you were not. This is a terrible, terrible thing that you're actually doing. But I would also like to say I'm PEN America's Utah chapter leader, and one of the questions you asked is, what is a book? What is the importance of a book? And I can tell you what the importance of a book is. I think we all know what the importance of a book is right now. I mean, we're talking about writing towards ourselves and writing the book, as Jericho so beautifully put it, that is not on the shelf, that is not seen. And what is happening now is that we're in a terrible situation where there are legislators who are trying to make sure people cannot see themselves in literature. They cannot see the full range and complexity of human experience reflected. And, the book is a political act. The book is a political document. Even if it pretends not to be political, it is. We should all be caring very, very much about the fact that we don't have, we're in a culture right now which is asking questions about, are books dangerous and should we remove them from the shelves? Because when we're writing about ourselves and we're writing ourselves into being, we're helping other people write themselves into being too. And it's everyone's right to see their own lives reflected in literature. And I just feel that very strongly. So the book, I'll fight to the death for the book.
I guess I want to respond to the idea of a book in two ways. In terms of my own practice, I like to write poem by poem. And I like to, like Jericho was saying, sort of from the inside out. I don't want to know too soon what a book is going to be about. Because if I think I know where a book is headed, there's less discovery. I sort of have to muck around and lose my way and make a mess of things, but then I discover as I'm working, I think it was Ruthke who said, I learn by going where I have to go. As I'm working, I discover things I wouldn't otherwise have seen. I can't just envision it. And so as I'm working, I start to, over several years, lay out poems on the floor. And then I have this eccentricity where I like to put blank pages between the poems that exist. And I ask myself, how are these poems in conversation with each other? Are there poems that haven't emerged that link or bridge a poem to another poem? And I sort of move and reorchestrate, so I don't know where the beginning is, where the end of the book is, but I do feel like it's a field of energy. Yeah. And ultimately, there are some poems that maybe don't make it into the book because they don't sort of quite earn their way into that field of energy, but I also need to feel that sense of unfolding and discovery through the process of the book. But I also want to add, when you're talking about what's the importance of a book in terms of my own experience of poetry, last night I was talking at dinner with Brian Dice about a poem by Pablo Neruda called Walking Around. And I mentioned that the title's in English and the rest of the poem is in Spanish. And when I was in my early 20s, when I discovered Pablo Neruda's Residency 1, and I was reading Robert Bly's translations in English, and eventually I learned enough Spanish to be able to read Neruda and Lorca in the original, but in the beginning I was relying on translation. When I read some of those poems, it just took my breath away. It was like Emily Dickinson said, you may not be able to define a poem, but you know it when it takes the top of your head off. And when you find a book of poetry that is really powerful like that, it totally just galvanizes your energy. It was like, it took my breath away. It's like, this is a book of poems that is astonishing, that I wanted to read and reread and reread and sort of live through that. And there aren't that many books in my experience that have done that, but one about 10 years ago, the poet Inger Christensen, who has a book called Alphabet, and you would think it's a silly structure. It's based on the Fibonacci sequence. So you have one line, and then you have two lines, and you add 1 and 2, and then that makes the next one is 3 lines. But then 2 and 3 make 5, and then 3 and 5 make 8. And so as you're moving through the alphabet, suddenly this sort of delta of language pours out, and it's all about, climate change, natural disaster, urgency, the fragility of life, and that took my breath away. It was like, she's a poet here, and it's like, when that happens, the value of a book of poetry is impossible to quantify, but I can say it makes me see the whole world with fresh eyes, with urgency, with gratitude, and there's nothing else like it.
I'm so glad you mentioned that book. That was one that also just blew me away. I remember exactly where I was when I read that book. I was on an airplane and I had just picked it up. I was in Norway. I managed to get a copy in a bookstore and I opened it up and I just thought, this is the best thing. This is the best thing I've read for years. And yeah, it's such a good book.
It's essentially a nautilus that circles on itself. And, but yeah, I've given away more copies of that book than I can remember. But so, I'm curious whether or not any of you have ever published a book which you've later felt was unfinished, that the obsessions keep coming back. I mean, Jericho, I think you need to write some more chuntos and maybe some duplexes.
One more duplex, Jericho.
Yeah.
Just one more.
Just one more.
Just one more.
I'm still writing duplexes. So I imagine if I ever have a book again, maybe they'll be in that book. I don't think what you write about, I don't even think your obsessions will change, but I don't think they have to. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they have to change because the perspective from which you will see them will always be shifting because life will change around you. You will get older, you'll fall in love, you'll fall out of love. What I love about poetry is I read a poem about a tree, and the tree that I saw every day that I thought I felt a certain way about, I see that tree differently. And so I don't think I would ever put out a book that I thought of as unfinished, and I hope you would never let me. But I don't mind if themes from past books reappear in new ones. I expect them to,
Yeah, I think the questions don't change, they just get deeper. So there are books that I will be happy if the copyright runs out on and they don't appear again in the world necessarily, but it's a different thing. And just because I think aesthetically, or the questions, like I say, they get deeper and richer, the formal questions become more interesting. And so it's hard to look back in your early work and go, yeah, that first book, so happy I saw that got in the world. So, but I think, I did write a book about cultural appropriation in literature, and actually that is probably the one book that's guaranteed, as soon as you're done, someone's gonna do something awful that you didn't anticipate, and then you're like, oh, I should have written a chapter about that. Or, because Jessica Krug came, was unveiled literally like the week after the book was published. And I was like, well, I didn't see her coming, but I should have. And then I was thinking also this whole book, West, is about, it's culturally appropriative. It is appropriation at its root. And so what if there were another chapter in there thinking about what is the work that documentary poetry does, that's appropriate? I do talk about the upsides of literary appropriation. It does have ethical upsides, but did I take that as seriously as I might? Are there forms of literature, forms of poetry in their appropriations that actually have really ethical impacts that maybe we should pursue more often? So I kind of I might add another chapter to that someday, but later.
So Arthur, with the Silk Dragon, there were some more translations that you wanted to add, and I'm wondering if there are other books where you've wanted to add in subsequent editions, add new poems.
I think for my own poetry, the work is always unfinished, and the book gets to a certain stage, and then it's there, and I let it go. In terms of the translations, in 2001, I published a book called The Silk Dragon that had classical Chinese poems translated, that I translated into English, starting with Tao Chen from 400 Common Era, and it ran all the way up through the 1950s to Communist Party poems in Sichuan province. And I always felt that book was incomplete because it left out contemporary Chinese poetry. And at that time, it felt that's all I could do. I didn't really know a lot of the contemporary Chinese poets, but then over the last 20 years, I've gotten to meet many of them at different festivals, and I've been able to sit down and go through their poems character by character. So it made sense for me to think about reissuing The Silk Dragon, to bring it not just from 400 and ending in a kind of propaganda poetry publication in the 1950s, where everything is sort of presented as a kind of utopian vision of communist society, but to bring some of the complexities, some of the difficulties. And Chinese poetry today is very complex, with poets in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Germany, the United States, France. There's a whole diaspora, and poets who negotiate different issues of censorship, who have pseudonyms, who keep changing their pseudonyms. And to address some of that complexity, I really wanted to add to the previous Silk Dragon, because I felt like now there's a sense of tradition and rupture and transformation, and you can see all of that happening in the contemporary scene. So that had a kind of urgency for me to reissue that. But in terms of my own poetry, I've never felt like, oh, that was something, there wasn't a similar kind of thing.
So just a couple more questions. We're running low on time here, but I'm just wondering, earlier I had read that quote from June Jordan, and she talks about some poetry not being bumper sticker sloganeering. And of course, when she wrote that, social media didn't exist, and Twitter didn't. And I'm wondering, how do you see the similarities and differences between the language of poetry and the language and other forms of language, expressive language?
I mean, for me...
What makes poetry poetry for you, essentially?
Well, for me, what makes poetry poetry is that, every other form of writing that we have uses elements of what's in poetry. But what makes poetry difficult or different or exciting, I should just say exciting, is it's the collision of all of these elements together. It's not just imagery, it's not just syntax, it's not just lines, it's not just metaphor, it's not just rhythm and rhyme. A poem means something because all of these things are working together. And I think that's why people freak out when they get a poem. You know, they think, oh my God, there's just so much. It can mean anything. I don't know what. But I think those are actually, you know, those elements, while they feel fractal and enormous, are actually limited. It's the conversation that happens between them. And I think that's what makes poetry so special. Twitter or prose pieces, they have a couple of these elements, but not all of them together. It's the difference between someone playing a tuba out in a field and getting a whole symphony. Like, I think of Twitter as a tuba in a field, played by a moron that won't stop. But, you know, we're out here trying to make symphonies, and I think that that's what makes it so special and so endlessly productive. Mm-hmm. Now everyone's like, it's a tuba in a field, played by an idiot who wants to build a rocket to Mars. Anyway. Sorry, please shut off my microphone. Somebody take it away. You got something there?
I think I want to say about what Paisley just said. It's all of those things, and the poet is doing them all at once.
And all at once, I know.
Which I love about my job, baby. I feel like big stuff. You know what I mean? Like, and what I'm impressed by when I read poems, that it's very clear to me when I'm working and when I read other people's poems that they're not handling these things turn by turn, one at a time. Like, I'm doing rhyme, I'm doing rhythm, I'm doing tone, I'm doing imagery, I'm doing it all at once in every line. Yeah.
It just never stops.
And I think, you know, and I think that's real talent.
Yeah.
And I think, I think the difference between poetry and everything else is that poetry is dangerous. I think it should be dangerous. I think what Paisley said earlier about ultimately about censorship has to do with, I myself have been disinvited from places in the state that borders the state where I live because people very directly say that, now is not the time, as we feel like this, what you have to say, your poems might make an audience uncomfortable. And I don't know what else my poems were ever supposed to be doing other than making an audience uncomfortable. I really think that poems make us look. There is something in people, and I think in Americans in particular, that allows us to make decisions about those outside of ourselves without first looking at ourselves. Do you know what I mean? If we were to look at ourselves, it would be very difficult to make any decisions about people other than yourself. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? And if you can live with yourself, if you can look at yourself and live with yourself, that's ultimately what poems ask us to do. They ask you to look at yourself, but don't kill yourself. Do you know what I mean? And that's difficult.
Yes.
That's very difficult for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. And for me, it's very important that poems, no matter how loving the most loving love poem is, it must still be somehow dangerous. And if poems were not dangerous, people would not be trying to censor them. People would not be trying to take them off shelves. I wrote a book of poetry, and people are saying, oh, I'm not sure if we could have this book in our library. I wrote a book of poetry, and when I get somewhere to give a reading, people want to take me aside and have a conversation with me about, so what are you going to read? I'm going to read the poems in my book that you read before I got here. And I just think you have to want, it's a lot to want, but you have to want that because that leads to vulnerability and intimacy. And everything in our culture tells us to turn away from vulnerability and intimacy. It's absolutely crazy. Everybody want to be in love, but you don't get to fall in love if you're not vulnerable. So how are you going to fall in love? Do you understand? So, I'm sorry, I'm talking, I'm turn my mic off. Anyway, that's all, I'll stop.
Yeah, part of that, and then I want to have Arthur answer, is I was thinking of Hayden Carruth's great line that what a poem is never to be known, for which I've learned to be grateful. And I think, so what's dangerous is sometimes uncertainty and not knowing, and as you say, vulnerability.
Yeah.
So
I would just add to the conversation that I think poems, in contrast to say social media or newspapers or whatever, require us to slow down, to pay attention to language, to care about meaning, and to read and reread and reread. I think of poetry as C.D. Wright said, it's as essential as breathing. It's an essential language. And it really asks us to slow down, to experience and re-envision. And in doing that, it's like looking at the world that when so much of society is trying to make us move quickly, think quickly, act quickly, it's in resistance to that. It's saying poetry addresses a deep part of ourselves where, look, we need to be able to be conscious of what we're experiencing, what we're choosing to experience, how we're making our choices, how we're living this life.
And so with that, we're going to spend another 3 hours here talking, right? No, well, thank you all for coming tonight. And thank you, Lynn.
That was great. Oh, look at all those people.